During his campaign, candidate Obama promised that his administration would not wait until the end of its term to address the seemingly intractable Arab-Israeli conflict. After a year in office, we'll take a look at how he's doing. This week on Dialogue, President Obama's Middle East report card. Hello again and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Today, we turn our attention to President Obama's efforts to play the role of peacemaker in the Middle East. Our guests are Aaron David Miller. He spent 2 decades at the U.S. Department of State as an advisor to 6 different secretaries of state. He's now a Wilson Center public policy scholar focusing on Palestinian and Israeli politics and relations and negotiations in the Middle East. David Ottaway is a former investigative reporter, national security correspondent, and bureau chief for The Washington Post. He's now a senior scholar at the Wilson Center, focusing on Middle East politics and Saudi Arabia. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Welcome.
Pleasure, John.
Let's begin with the big picture. I know this could take 30 minutes, but I'll ask each of you to weigh in on and providing a broad overview of what the current situation is, what the issues are that this administration is going to be confronting. Let's begin with you, Aaron.
I mean, I think it's important to step back and look at this, or at least the current administration's policies from the perspective of the previous administration. The last president was a transformational president when it came to foreign policy. Big ideas, democratization, regime change, preemptive and preventative military action. This president, I would argue, is a transactional president. He's put much more of an emphasis on diplomacy, to use that famous word, on engagement. And he's not a black or white president in the sense that President Bush was. He sees the world much more in the color of gray, which I would argue is essentially the color of diplomacy. It's meeting mutual needs and requirements. Not everybody gets what they want. You compromise, I compromise, America compromises. The problem he faces is that he is in a cruel and unforgiving world for transactional diplomacy. I mean, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, the Arab-Israeli issue. So he's got huge challenges with very high expectations.
Mm-hmm. David.
Well, I think you have to kind of take it area by area. I'm struck by the contrast between his very thoughtful approach to what to do in Afghanistan, taking his time, weighing the consequences, the options, and how he rushed, in the case of the Middle East, to try and get peace negotiations going immediately upon becoming president, raising high hopes, taking a very kind of forward position on getting talks going. And of course, that has not served him well.
Why did he do that? What is your guess on? Was it momentum coming out of the campaign, excitement, feeling a need to hit the ground running? Why did he rush into this problem that other presidents have eased into?
Well, it's true. He went at this problem harder, faster, and louder, at least the Israeli-Palestinian piece of it, than any of his predecessors. I think it's a combination of factors. I think it's we're going to do things differently than our predecessor. I think that's part of it. I think there was a certain amount of naivete that they could get in this case, the Israelis to agree to a comprehensive settlement freeze and then get the Arabs to somehow normalize with the Israelis. I think he also saw that he had a credibility deficit in the Arab and Muslim world. And I think went to great lengths, the Cairo speech is one example of that, to shore up American stock and credibility. Barack Hussein Obama is now speaking to the Arab world in a much different way than either Bill Clinton spoke to it or George W. Bush. The danger, of course, is that you get all dressed up and there's nowhere to go. And I agree with David. If I were to give a grade, I would say overall he has a B. But on the Middle East peace process, I mean, we're somewhere between a C- and a D+.
Not bad, huh?
I think so. I think they've badly damaged American credibility over the past 10 months. It's not fatal. Other administrations have run off the highway in the first year. It's not fatal, but it's going to be excruciatingly painful to get this thing back on track.
David, while we're into the letter grading, do you agree with that assessment?
Pretty much. I would say that, yeah, I would agree. I don't know whether it's a C minus or C plus, but it's certainly in the C range for the Middle East.
Aaron, I mentioned in the introduction that you worked with 6 secretaries of state and also 4 presidents. Can you do any comparison to, everything is contextual, what this president has walked into compared to what you've seen in the past?
Well, first of all, he inherited a profoundly or galactic domestic set of problems, which is his first priority. Unemployment, over 10% now. Health care, which he's committed to. The Middle East is not going to determine whether or not he gets reelected or not, assuming that there is no next attack against the continental United States during his first 4 years, which is always a serious problem. So he will not be made or unmade by this region. It's just that he, as David put it, has run after this issue, the Arab-Israeli issue, where there really was not a need to go out as hard and as fast. He should have been, I would argue, as contemplative and deliberative as he's been on Afghanistan to try to get things right, if that's indeed possible, on the diplomatic front as well. Now, there's more urgency in Afghanistan. We've got troops on the ground. But there's a fair amount of urgency in the Arab-Israeli issue as well. I just think it was incumbent on him, I think, to take a little more time and avoid a situation where he is essentially allowed everybody, the Israelis, no to settlements freeze. The Arabs, no to normalization. The Palestinians, no, we won't go back to the negotiations. And when you say no, when the small power says no to the great power without cost or consequence, it's not good for the great power.
Do you think that there's any situation here where perhaps the administration was guilty, or the president in particular, of believing his own clippings? Sort of came in as the rock star president, great popularity around the world, and thought that he could just ride that wave and make something happen quickly?
I think the tragedy is more that he really cares about the Middle East and the Palestinian problem. This is, I think it's a gut issue for him. It's something he's talked to many Arab scholars about. He really wanted to do something to move that process forward and to get a Palestinian state for the Palestinians. He wanted to not just make a nice speech, he wanted to show he was out to do something. That it was not just words, which is what the Arab world had listened to for 8 years from President Bush, but he was going to take action. So to me, there's the makings for kind of a great personal tragedy here, particularly if this goes nowhere, as it seems now is likely. That here's a president who really cared, tried to rush off and show that he cared, and has just run into a brick wall.
He's 1 year into his administration. Can you say that? I mean, he could be there he certainly will be there another 3 years. He could be there another 4 more after that. And you still think it could be that tragically decided already?
I think the circumstances for real tragedy are sown. Unless he himself really gets involved, the way we saw, I don't know, you have to go back to Carter maybe, or the end of the Clinton administration. But that takes enormous energy and perseverance and skill. And he's got so many problems, I don't know how much time he can devote to this.
Where can he put this on his list of priorities? Versus perhaps where should he put this on his list of priorities? I mean, Rome is burning, and he's got all kinds of things nagging at him right here at home, yet war on 2 fronts and these intractable issues.
I think you just said it, though, that he's made certain commitments during the campaign. Boots on the ground when it involves American men and women in harm's way is always the top priority. So making sure that Iraq continues to, quote unquote, go well to allow America to extricate its forces by the end of next year. Trying to get Afghanistan right, which is going to be very, very hard. Those are his top priorities. And of course, trying to head off, if we're still on track for an Iranian-Israeli brouhaha over nuclear weapons, I would argue those are your top priorities. In an odd way, those are very tough situations. The Arab-Israeli issue, you could argue, is the least hopeless of the 3. And that's where David's point is, I think, so right, that It really, in the end, has less to do with how much he cares and a great deal to do with what the raw material he finds on the ground is all about. And this is where I think he inherits a cruel and unforgiving world. And no matter how much he wants this, the gaps between Benjamin Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas on the big issues, Jerusalem border security and refugees, are huge. These are not heroic leaders. This is not Sadat or Begin or Hussein or Rabin. These are men who are prisoners of their politics, not masters of their constituencies. So he could want this in a very bad way and still run into trouble. And there is where you do get the element of the makings of a tragedy.
Does Obama view himself as a heroic leader?
You know, it's hard to imagine that a guy who was in the Senate from Illinois and who is such a newcomer on the political scene would think of himself as a transformative, heroic personality, because he has a sense of detachment and self-deprecation, which should get in the way of that. Mm-hmm. But, you know, I compare him, and I'm not comparing his accomplishments, but he's in a way an upstart like Lincoln was an upstart. And yet Lincoln proved to be heroic, in part because he was tremendously ambitious, but in part because he inherited a nation-encumbering crisis. He really did inherit the stage on which he could be great. I'm not sure, and I'm working on this book now called Can America Have Another Great President, whether any president on this stage, with a 24/7 media, with a Congress of naysayers and splits within his own party, with the galactic challenges that we confront, I don't know whether that stage is available for real greatness. But I think in the answer to your question, I think yes. I think that if so many people keep telling you you're a transformative figure, if your own rhetoric is so profoundly eloquent, which it is, if you're the first African-American president, you've already broken an extraordinary mold. Yeah, I think he does see himself as a shaper of history.
Within the Arab world, he came in with a lot of goodwill. He was in a unique position based on his own personal story to change the tone. Certainly that has happened. Give us an update there on expectations within the Arab world. Country you're very familiar with, Saudi Arabia. Tell us about Israel. Tell us about the Palestinians. What do we know?
I think there's already a deep disappointment with the way things are going. The Saudis in particular and the Egyptians went through this with George Bush when he became president, because his father had done so much in the Arab world during the first Gulf War to chase Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, and there'd been a huge coalition in which the United States had cooperated very closely with Saudi Arabia and Egypt. They thought his son would also be like the father, and they had enormous hopes for George W. when he first came in. And then within 6 months, they were deeply disappointed because he wasn't paying any attention to the Middle East at all. And in fact, they went to his father to try to get the son to get more involved. So now they're going through this once again. They had high hopes for Obama, President Obama, when he first came in, because of what he had said, because of who he was, and because initially he said very nice things about the Arab peace plan that the Saudis, King Abdullah had actually put forward himself. Because his first interview after becoming president was with a Saudi-owned television station, they had enormous hopes. And then when he grabbed onto the settlement issue and seemed to make it a sine qua non for any kind of progress in peace talks, they got very concerned. And when he failed to make any progress on that issue, they got even more concerned, because now they're worried he has no pull or weight in Israel to put any effective pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu to make any kind of compromise in forthcoming negotiations. So the disappointment is quite profound.
Does the Israelis trust the president?
You know, if you look at the opinion polls, I don't know how reliable they are. The answer would be stunningly no. That Barack Obama has managed within a scant 10 months to create a situation in which he is not trusted by large numbers of Israelis and has profoundly disappointed large numbers of Arabs and Palestinians. But again, I think a year into an arguably 4-year, maybe even an 8-year presidency, is I think we have to exercise some measure of discipline and restraint. He does have an extraordinarily difficult task. No one ever lost money betting against Arab-Israeli peace. Chances are he won't either. He cares about it, as David said. At some point, I would argue, when healthcare is done and the decision-making process in Afghanistan is complete, maybe at 3 a.m. in the morning, when he's walking the halls in that extraordinary residence, you know, surrounded by history, he'll ask himself 2 questions. Number 1, how much do I really care about Arab-Israeli peace? Really? And number 2, how much am I prepared to risk in order to achieve it? If the answer to both questions is a great deal, then I think maybe, just maybe, given his skills, if he's prepared to be tough, smart, and fair, he's got to be tough, smart, and fair. He'll take a whack at it, and who knows? I wouldn't count him out. I just, the odds aren't great.
If the answers to those questions go in the opposite direction, is there any hope? In other words, is the U.S. a necessity in this equation? Can anyone else broker this kind of deal?
Yes, U.S. is essential.
It is essential?
Maybe not to get things going, but to have the end process, yes.
No one else can step into that void? No other country?
No. I mean, and for one politically incorrect reason. We are the only party that has a close, intimate relationship with the Israelis. And when we choose to use that relationship appropriately, in a way that benefits our interests as well as Israel's, the past has demonstrated, Kissinger, Carter, and Baker, that we can actually succeed. But no one else has that opportunity. Not the Brits, not the French, not the Russians, certainly not the UN or the European Union. So we are indispensable. But David's quite right. Getting things started, we don't have to be involved in. Finishing them up, if the past is prologue, and I think it is, we'll have to be there.
You mentioned your formula for focus: borders, security, refugees, Jerusalem, not freezes on settlements. You agree with that formation, as those are the key things, the elements that need to be worked on? Could we break those down a little bit? Could you expand on that a bit? And
sure.
What are the things that need to happen?
And by the way, I'm not trivializing the importance of settlement activity. I mean, of all the things,
I think you've written that if you take care of borders, that will
right.
follow.
If you can address the territorial issue, presumably, you can also deal with the settlements issue. I mean, these are the 4 core issues that drive the Arab-Israeli conflict. They are going to be tough to resolve, much more difficult than anything that Arabs and Israelis have encountered before, either in Egypt and Israel or Israel and Jordan. You have 2 territorial issues, arguably, borders and security, and 2 identity issues, Jerusalem and refugees. I would argue to you that the problem here is not the absence of clever fixes. People are aware of what is required to meet Palestinian and Israeli needs. The question is the absence of political will and courage and determination to overcome these gaps. Because I'll tell you right now, the notion that we're this close to an agreement, which is a myth that has emerged over the course of the last decade in the wake of the Camp David summit, is not accurate. We're about, I don't know if I'm still on camera here, we're about this close to an agreement.
So this myth arose because of the optimism following Camp David?
Myth arose because as the politics of how the summit ended became more heated, the orthodox interpretation was the Israelis put an incredibly magnanimous offer on the table, which was almost everything the Palestinians needed. Arafat said no, and then went to violence. So the need to create an image that we were very close, and only as a consequence of Palestinian obstreperousness or intransigence did the summit fail, began to create this notion, and then other negotiations seemed to feed that notion that everybody knows what the outcome is. I've heard this a million times, as if that's supposed to make people feel better. It's not that, it's how do you produce the outcome, which the President of the United States is now, with which he's now grappling.
We were still cleaning up litter from the mall after the inauguration when George Mitchell was appointed as a special envoy, and you have a high-profile Secretary of State in Hillary Clinton. Many think that's kind of star potential. Can these players make a difference? Are these people who can gain any traction?
You know, there's no replacement for the President of the United States. If he is not personally involved in how things are shaped out there, I don't think and puts his prestige and energy into the issue, I don't think it makes too much difference who's the special envoy.
Earlier, Aaron, you mentioned that Abbas and Netanyahu don't qualify as heroic leaders or don't see themselves as such. Are there any leaders in the Middle East we should be aware of in this equation who have the potential to be real difference makers, who could step up and change the terms of the debate?
Well, if we talk about political actors, I think we should think about events on the ground. Very often in the Middle East, what forces decisions is events on the ground. And in the absence of any kind of progress, the political actors may be another intifada, it may be another assassination attempt. Something will happen in the Middle East that will in effect be the main catalyst and political actor to get something going.
What you're describing is we have a chronic set of circumstances here, and chronic conditions don't change till they hit an acute stage. Yeah. The fever has to rise before it breaks. Yeah. Is that where you see this?
John, I think that's absolutely right. And David's conceit that events become a substitute for individuals is a really good one. Because every time there's been a great breakthrough, it's because the status quo was somehow rearranged and enough pain was manifest with the prospects of gain, pain and gain, which then allowed the smart, tough, and fair American mediator to do something with it. And I think that's absolutely the point. We are out of the era of heroic politics, in my judgment, not just in the Arab-Israeli arena, but across the board in this region. It's a preview
of where your book is headed.
We're in the age of just politics, which is one of the reasons I suspect we're struggling with this, because it really takes a marriage of special circumstances and special people to do this. It's so excruciatingly painful, and the costs, Sadat, Rabin, are existential in character. It's not losing power that's at stake here. It's very often losing your life. And everyone is aware of this. I watched Barak and Arafat at Camp David. They sat in the same cabin as Sadat and Begin. What do you think Arafat must have been thinking? He's the second Arab leader to be invited to Camp David. The first was murdered. And Barak is looking, I'm looking at Barak and I'm thinking, to what degree is he thinking about Rabin and Rabin's assassination? So you need courageous, willful people to do this. But David's 100% right. They won't do it unless the circumstances that either they try to create or act upon them give them the stage to do it.
One of the mistakes we sometimes make when we talk about these things is thinking in a linear fashion and ignoring potential generational changes. What can each of you tell us about generational handoffs taking place in all of the countries involved in these disputes and how that might change the formula? In other words, is there reason to be either optimistic or pessimistic based on the next generation coming into power?
Well, you're talking on the Arab side. Well, Abbas, he's, I don't know, what is he, 70-something?
74.
Under him, I think there's a real question of who would take over leadership from him. I don't know whether Fayyad, the finance minister, is capable of rising to that occasion, but it's not evident who would, drag the Palestinians towards unity between Hamas and Fatah, the two main factions, or who would be willing to stick their neck out on peace negotiations, given what's happened so far. I think it's going to have to neither be. I don't expect the Israelis are going to. Netanyahu is going to try to become a hero in peace negotiations. So you're back to Obama and what he's willing to do. And as Aaron said, that look in the mirror sometime at 3 o'clock in the morning, how much do I care about this?
Aaron, when you look at young Israelis or young Palestinians and you try to figure it out, are they just so used to it that they accept this as a state of being, or are they tired of it and they yearn for a conclusion more than their parents or grandparents did?
Well, I think everybody is tired. I mean, to the question, do Israelis and Palestinians want this to end, the answer is resounding, yes, they do. To the question, do their political elites want to pay the price to end it? The question is a resounding probably not. I think we underestimate the extent to which Israelis and Palestinians are willing to absorb pain and inflict it on one another. Number one. Number two, there's a perverse logic that operates here. The situation is bad. It's cruel. It's tragic. But it never gets to the point where it is so qualitatively horrible that it forces people into a position to act. It's almost as if there's a balancing mechanism, that both sides get to the point where they say, okay, we've gone too far now.
They just pull up short
and
of the fever breaking.
And we're going to pull back. So I don't want to believe. I worked with an organization called Seeds of Peace, which deals with young Arabs and Israelis. I don't want to give up on the next generation, but I think in the Arab side and in Israel, we've seen the transition from fathers to sons. We've seen it from King Hussein to Abdullah, from one Assad to another, from King Hassan Morocco to his son Mohammed. You get more practicality and pragmatism, but less moral authority and legitimacy. That's the problem. And on the Israeli side, you have young Israeli prime ministers who don't have the kind of moral authority. They're not of the founding generation.
Gentlemen, thank you. As some of these events on the ground that we anticipate could be game changers occur, maybe we can have you back and pick this up where we're leaving off.
Love to.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. In addition to thanking our guests, we want you to know that we appreciate your comments and encourage you to share them with us. You can do so by sending email to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. We look forward to hearing from you. In the meantime, and until next week, for all of us here at the Wilson Center and Dialogue, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for watching.
Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.